Orin the Red died wearing a shape that belonged to someone else after Bhaal seized control of her body and twisted it into the Slayer with claws where her hands should have been, and hunger-driving muscles that had forgotten how to resist. Every trace of the woman who called herself chosen dissolving into the avatar her father demanded, until nothing remained but a puppet collapsing at the end of strings that had never once gone slack. Sarevok Anchev failed to become a god in 1368, and died for the failure before clawing his way back from the abyss years later, with ambition redirected rather than abandoned, returning to Baldur's Gate to build a breeding program across 3 generations of controlled blood that eventually manufactured a woman named Orin, who spent her entire life believing she was loved. This archive does not document a villain, but an experiment designed by a man who had already paid once for reaching too high and returned with a different theory about how divinity might be claimed. A man who decided that manufacturing Bhaal's vessel would succeed, where becoming that vessel had failed, and spent decades refining a bloodline until it produced exactly the instrument required, in a creature so devoted to murder she would never question why she existed, and so eager for use that she would beg for the hand wielding her. Orin the Red, emerging from a program rather than a womb, and shaped by design rather than chance, and sharpened to her finest edge before Bhaal examined the result and found it insufficient and dismissed the entire project with 2 words that erased everything Sarevok had built. Not enough. To understand Orin, you must first understand what Sarevok learned from dying in 1368, when he was the most dangerous Bhaalspawn on the Sword Coast and capable of orchestrating an iron crisis to destabilize an entire region while manipulating merchant guilds, alongside mercenary companies, alongside noble houses, and murdering his way to the edge of apotheosis through sheer violence matched with cunning. A man convinced that killing enough siblings, while accumulating enough divine essence, would let him claim Bhaal's vacant throne, until adventurers tracked him to the Undercity, beneath Baldur's Gate, and fought through defenses he had considered impenetrable, and killed him in the temple where ascension was supposed to begin. Resurrection came years later, when the very sibling whose companions had destroyed him pulled Sarevok back from the abyss and stripped away the divine essence during the process, and left him mortal in ways he had never been before, as someone no longer Bhaalspawn and no longer carrying the god's blood, but reduced to a man with memories of almost becoming something greater, alongside precise knowledge of exactly where the strategy had collapsed. The failure being not violence itself, but the competition violence required in an approach that depended on eliminating rivals by killing other Bhaalspawn and absorbing their essence and climbing toward godhood over the corpses of siblings who refused to die quietly and fought back while forming alliances and developing countermeasures until one of them proved stronger than Sarevok himself and brought the entire methodology crashing down. The resurrection taught him something else when the sibling responsible for his death eventually rejected Bhaal entirely and walked away from divine inheritance and chose mortality over godhood, demonstrating through that choice that Bhaalspawn could be made and shaped and pointed in directions they did not choose for themselves and discarded when they failed to serve their purpose. Lessons Sarevok carried back to Baldur's Gate, alongside a conviction that competing for Bhaal's favor was the wrong approach, and that manufacturing that favor would succeed where competition had failed. The breeding program began with a doppelganger because Sarevok had worked with shapeshifters before and used them as agents during his original scheme, and learned to value their ability to infiltrate and impersonate and disappear into crowds that would never notice the difference, finding one willing to bear his children when he returned to the city in a creature whose nature would pass through the bloodline and whose gift for wearing other faces would become part of whatever dynasty he built. The first generation emerging as Helena, who was Sarevok's daughter by the shapeshifter, and raised in the cult of Bhaal from birth and trained in the theology of murder before she could read and taught to worship a god whose blood had run through her father's veins even after that blood was stripped away, growing into exactly what Sarevok designed her to become as a devoted killer and faithful servant and woman who loved her father with the desperate intensity of someone shown no other way to love. Helena inherited the shapeshifting that let her change her face and alter her form and become anyone she studied closely enough. Gifts that rendered her valuable, useful, exactly the kind of instrument Bhaal's work required. Sarevok looked at his daughter and saw a vessel rather than a child, a container for blood he was trying to preserve rather than a person. He wrote in private journals that the blood of Bhaal must never be wasted, but only multiplied, recording his methodology, documenting his reasoning with the cold precision of a breeder tracking livestock. The journals revealing calculation rather than madness, engineering rather than cruelty, a systematic approach to producing something he could not produce himself. He impregnated his own daughter. The writings are clinical, detached, focused entirely on the theological necessity of concentrating the bloodline, ensuring that whatever emerged from Helena would carry as much of Bhaal's legacy as possible. Nowhere in these documents does he acknowledge that what he was doing might be monstrous, because Sarevok had stopped thinking of family as people and started thinking of them as components in a mechanism designed to serve a god who had never once acknowledged him. Helena bore the child and named her Orin. She produced everything Sarevok had hoped for, a girl capable of shifting her face before she could walk, showing aptitude for violence before she could speak in complete sentences, seeming to understand instinctively that murder was worship, and that worship was the only thing that mattered. Sarevok raised the child to believe he was her grandfather while concealing the truth about parentage, withholding the knowledge that the man she called grandfather was also her father, that her mother was also her sister, concealment driven not by mercy but by control, because a child who understood her own origin might question it, resist it, develop independent judgment that would make her less useful as an instrument. Orin grew up in the Temple of Bhaal beneath Baldur's Gate, surrounded by killers, educated in the sacred art of ending lives, praised when she showed creativity in her methods, punished when she showed hesitation. She learned to associate love with approval with murder, understanding that the only way to make family proud was to make victims bleed. Brilliant at the work from the beginning, demonstrating gifts that exceeded her mother's before she was old enough to be formally initiated into the cult, showing the kind of natural talent that made senior priests speak of her in reverent whispers, developing the artistic sensibility that would define her approach to killing. Sarevok watched his granddaughter flourish and knew the experiment was working, and understood that experiments require testing, that testing requires competition. Helena wanted to be Bhaal's chosen. She had spent her entire life serving the god, killing in his name since childhood, bearing a child for the explicit purpose of furthering his bloodline, doing everything asked of her plus more. She was convinced this devotion entitled her to recognition, that her father would eventually acknowledge her as the instrument she had worked so hard to become. But Sarevok had different plans. He watched both women develop, compared their capabilities, assessed their potential with the same cold methodology he applied to everything, and concluded that Orin was the superior product, that Helena's usefulness had peaked, that the mother had served her purpose by producing the daughter and was now merely occupying space that could be better used. He ordered Helena to kill Orin. The instructions were framed as a test of faith, presented as an opportunity for Helena to prove devotion by sacrificing her own child to Bhaal. The reality was simpler and crueler, because Sarevok was staging a competition with an outcome he had already decided, forcing daughter against granddaughter in a confrontation that would eliminate the weaker product regardless of which one survived. Helena attacked in the night. She came to Orin's room while the girl slept, wrapped hands around her daughter's throat, began squeezing until the breath stopped. She was trying to end the life of the child she had carried and birthed and raised, crying while she did it, sobbing with grief even as her hands refused to stop, because this was what her father had commanded, and her father's commands were indistinguishable from Bhaal's will. Orin woke, small, physically weaker than her mother, but trained since birth in the art of killing, conditioned to respond to violence with greater violence, taught to treat every attack as an opportunity for worship. She felt her mother's hands on her throat and neither froze, nor begged, nor tried to reason with the woman choking her. She reached instead for a blade. The details vary depending on which account you believe, but the outcome remains consistent across all sources. Orin cut off her mother's hand and killed her, played with the severed hand while her mother's blood spread across the floor. At some point during the process, Bhaal himself manifested in the room, the god of murder appearing to witness what his youngest adherent had accomplished. Examining the result, the artistic arrangement of the body, the complete absence of hesitation or remorse, he declared that this one was exceptional, that this one would serve, that Sarevok should preserve this one and continue her education. Sarevok was surprised. His own writings admit he had expected the confrontation to go differently, perhaps hoped Helena would succeed and prove herself worthy after all. The surprise reveals something important about the man and his methodology, because he had built a competition he could not fully predict, set forces in motion that exceeded his ability to control, created something in Orin that even he did not entirely understand. But the experiment had worked. The bloodline had produced a chosen. The program was a success. Orin was never first. This fact defined her existence. The truth she spent her entire life trying to escape. The wound that no amount of murder could ever close. Above her, in Bhaal's favor, there was always someone else, a sibling or predecessor or rival, commanding more of the god's attention no matter how many throats she cut, or how beautifully she arranged the bodies. Orin never climbed high enough to reach the position she craved. The dark urge stood above her, another of Bhaal's children, created directly from the god's blood rather than bred through mortal generations. A being whose connection to murder was so pure and so absolute that the cultists called it the urge, because it killed not for worship or approval or love, but simply because killing was what it was. Bhaal favored this child above all others, above Orin, above anyone Sarevok had ever managed to produce. Orin served as the dark urge's second in command, followed its orders, executed its strategies, cleaned up its messes, watched it receive recognition she believed she deserved. She told herself this was temporary, that her time would come, that eventually Bhaal would see her artistry and her devotion and elevate her above this mindless butcher who did not even appreciate the beauty of what they were doing. The dark urge did not care about beauty. It understood something Orin never grasped, that Bhaal was not a god of artistic murder, not a connoisseur of elegant killing, not a deity who appreciated craftsmanship, but a god who wanted quantity, volume, as many deaths as possible delivered as quickly as possible. The dark urge's mindless slaughter pleased him far more than Orin's careful compositions ever could. Orin watched, waited, brooded, developed theories about why she had been passed over, convinced herself that the dark urge had somehow deceived their father, that Bhaal's preference was a mistake that would eventually be corrected, that she simply needed to demonstrate her superiority clearly enough for the hierarchy to realign in her favor. She was wrong about everything, and her wrongness did nothing to stop her from acting. When the Dead Three conspiracy began to take shape, the dark urge allied with Gortash alongside Ketheric Thorm to enslave an elder brain and create the cult of the Absolute. Orin recognized her moment. Her rival was distracted. The position she believed she had earned was finally within reach. She attacked the dark urge from behind, drove a blade into its skull, carved through bone and brain, dealt what should have been a killing blow. Then she did something that revealed the true nature of her ambition, implanting a mind flayer tadpole in the wound, infecting her rival with the same parasite they were using to build their cult's army, leaving the dark urge to die or transform or forget everything it had been. Orin took its place. She became Bhaal's chosen in the conspiracy, assumed command of the cult's murder operations, began killing her way through Baldur's Gate with authority she had craved for years. For a brief moment, she believed she had won at last, proven herself at last, claimed recognition that should have been hers from the beginning. But Bhaal is not a god who forgets, and the dark urge did not die. Orin's reign as chosen was a catalogue of errors. She killed constantly, murdered her way through the city with enthusiasm that shocked even veteran Bhaalists, arranged bodies in elaborate displays that demonstrated artistic vision. Every single death pushed her further from what her father actually wanted, because Bhaal had no interest in art, no appreciation for beauty, no patience for the thoughtful compositions Orin labored over. He wanted murder as industrial process, mass production, quantity beyond counting. The Dark Urge had understood this. When it led the cult, the killing was efficient, purposeful, designed to maximize death rather than maximize impact. The cult thrived under its leadership, growing, spreading, accumulating power, because mindless slaughter in Bhaal's name produces more murders than careful artistry ever could. Orin grasped something else entirely, convinced that Bhaal appreciated craftsmanship, that a beautiful kill was worth more than a dozen ugly ones, that the god of murder was also a god of aesthetics. This conviction was not merely wrong, but heretical, a fundamental misreading of her own religion that revealed how little she actually understood about the deity she worshipped. Her allies noticed. Gortash found her unreliable, prone to violence when discretion was required, incapable of subordinating urges to strategic necessity, a hindrance to the careful political work he was doing to position himself as Archduke. He began to plan betrayal, calculating how to eliminate this liability without losing access to her Netherstone. Ketheric Thorm found her distasteful, even by the standards of a man commanding armies of the dead. Orin's enthusiasm for suffering struck him as excessive, undisciplined, the behavior of a child playing at darkness rather than a peer worthy of respect. Sarevok found her disappointing. His writings from this period suggest doubt about the experiment. Wonder if concentrating the bloodline had produced intensity without wisdom, devotion without understanding, a weapon so eager to be used that it could not be aimed. He watched Orin squander the position she had stolen and saw his life's work collapse into chaos. Then the Dark Urge returned. The tadpole had failed to kill or transform it, succeeded only in erasing its memories. It came back to Baldur's Gate as something new, something that did not remember serving Bhaal, something that might choose differently than before. This return forced Orin into a confrontation she believed she had already won, drove her to respond with threats, displays, elaborate psychological games. She shapeshifted into people the Dark Urge knew, revealed herself at dramatic moments, made speeches about rivalry and superiority that wasted time better spent killing, proved she cared more about recognition than about doing Bhaal's work. The confrontation came in the temple where Orin had grown up, the same halls where she had killed her mother, the same altar where she had begged for recognition. Orin faced the Dark Urge, surrounded by her cultists, armed with her Netherstone and empowered by years of service to the god she loved more than she had ever loved anything. It was still not enough to defeat the Dark Urge. The details of the fight matter less than what happened after. Bhaal spoke to Orin as she lay dying, his voice coming through the skull effigy carved into the temple wall. His words were not comfort, not praise, not acknowledgement of service. They were command, final order, demand that she transform into the Slayer and continue fighting even though she had already been defeated. Orin's body twisted into the monster form as her will disappeared beneath Bhaal's control, her identity dissolving into the shape of his avatar, her flesh becoming a puppet moving only because the god demanded movement. In that moment, she was exactly what she had always been, a puppet whose strings had never once gone slack. Bhaal's favorite was never Orin. She knew this from the beginning, carried the knowledge through every kill, every composition, every desperate attempt to earn recognition. Everything she ever did was an attempt to change a verdict already delivered, impossible to appeal, rendered before she was born. She failed and was destined to fail, because Orin was never meant to be chosen. She was meant to be evidence that the choosing worked, proof that the bloodline could produce servants devoted enough to be useful, demonstration that Sarevok's breeding program had successfully manufactured the kind of instrument Bhaal's cult required. The fact that she exceeded expectations, showed potential beyond prediction, briefly held the position of chosen at all, changed none of her fundamental purpose. She was a prototype. Prototypes get discarded when the production model arrives, the Dark Urge destined to be favored over her, destined to command the devotion she craved, destined to occupy the position she believed she deserved because the Dark Urge was created directly by Bhaal, while Orin was manufactured by a mortal man. No amount of breeding or training or devotion was capable of closing that gap. She was not chaos. She was output. Sarevok understood this. His writings suggest knowledge that Orin would never be first, that the best he could hope for was a useful tool in a hierarchy controlled by beings his experiments could not replicate. He built Orin anyway, raised her knowing she would lose, sent her into a competition already decided, because even a second-place instrument serves Bhaal's purpose, even a failed experiment generates useful data, even a discarded prototype proves methodology is sound. Orin never understood this. She remained convinced she was competing for a prize that could be won, that artistry would eventually be recognized, that love was something she could earn if she just killed beautifully enough. This conviction sustained her through years of subordination, dismissal, humiliation, until the moment Bhaal seized control of her body and used her up. Love has no place in a machine like this. It will consume what it made, discard what failed, build again, then forget what came before. Orin fell into a process that began before her birth and continued long after her death, a process indifferent to art, beauty, or devotion, and driven only by scale, by volume, by death delivered through whatever tool lay closest. Sarevok remains in the temple. For decades he has overseen the Murder Tribunal, passed judgment on those who seek entry as unholy assassins, and carried forward work begun long ago. When questioned about Orin, he answered with dismissal, called her disappointing, described unrealized potential, and recorded that the trial produced mixed outcomes, requiring further refinement. Grief never entered the record, only notes remained, because records allow improvement, expose flaws, and guide the next attempt towards something worthy of the god it serves. Over time, he learned to think in generations, to treat offspring as data rather than people, and to accept that affection weakens any process built for murder. Helena's corpse remains suspended in Orin's quarters, preserved exactly as it was left. One hand gone, injuries visible, trophy, memorial, or confirmation that selection succeeded, that the stronger outcome erased the weaker, that the bloodline advanced through violence. Orin is gone, yet the program continues. In the hidden quarters of Baldur's Gate, where devotion to Bhaal never ceased, another generation takes shape. Another life absorbs the lesson that murder equals love. Another tool forms for a god that will never learn its name.